Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Western Canon Challenge, where we are reading the entirety of the Western literary canon out loud. Today we are continuing with The Birth of Tragedy, and we are up to Section 10. And with that said, I'll get started. It is an incontestable tradition that Greek tragedy in its oldest form had as its subject only the suffering of Dionysus, and that for a long time later the individually present stage heroes were only Dionysus. But with the same certainty we can assert that right up to the time of Euripides, Dionysus never ceased being the tragic hero, that all the famous figures of the Greek theater, like Prometheus, Oedipus, and so on, are only masks of that primordial hero Dionysus. The fact that behind all these masks stands a divinity, that is the fundamental reason for the frequently admired characteristic, quote-unquote, ideality of those well-known figures. Someone, I don't know who, asserted that all individuals as individuals have to be taken as comic and thus untragic, that the Greeks in general could not tolerate individuals in their tragic theater. In fact, they seem to have felt this way. That Platonic distinction between evaluation of the idea in contrast to the idol in connection with likeness lies deeply grounded in the nature of the Greeks. But for us to make use of Plato's terminology, we would have to talk of the tragic figures of the Greek stage in something like the following terms. The one truly real Dionysus appears in a multiplicity of shapes in the mask of a struggling hero, and, as it were, bound up in the nets of the individual will. So now the God made manifest talks and acts in such a way that he looks like an erring, striving, suffering individual. The fact that he appears in general with this epic definition and clarity is the effect of Apollo, the interpreter of dreams, who indicates to the chorus its Dionysian state by this metaphorical appearance. In reality, however, that hero is the suffering Dionysus of the mysteries, that God who experiences the suffering of the individual in himself, the God about whom the amazing myths tell how he, as a child, was dismembered by the Titans, and now in this condition is venerated as Zagreus. Through this is revealed the idea that this dismemberment, the essentially Dionysian suffering, is like a transformation into air, water, earth, and fire, that we also have to look upon the condition of individuation as the source and basis for all suffering, as something in itself reprehensible. From the laughing of this Dionysus arose the Olympian gods, from his tears arose mankind. In that existence as dismembered god, Dionysus has the dual nature of a cruelly savage daemon and a lenient, gentle master. The initiates of the Eleusinian mysteries hoped for a rebirth of Dionysus, which we now can understand as the mysterious end of individuation. The initiate's song of jubilation cried out to this approaching third Dionysus. And only with this hope was there a ray of joy on the face of the fragmented world, torn apart into individuals, just as myth reveals in the picture of the eternal sorrow of sunken Demeter, who rejoices against the first time when someone says to her that she might be able once again to give birth to Dionysus. In these established concepts, we already have assembled all the components of a profound and pessimistic worldview, together with the mysterious teaching of tragedy. The basic acknowledgement of the unity of all existing things, the idea of individuation as the ultimate foundation of all evil, art as the joyful hope that the spell of individuation is there for us to break as a premonition of a re-established unity. It has been pointed out earlier that the Homeric epic is the poetry of Olympian culture, with which it sang its own song of victory over the terrors of the fight against the Titans. Now, under the overwhelming influence of tragic poetry, the Homeric myths were newly reborn and shown in this metamorphosis, that by now the Olympian culture is overcome by an even deeper worldview. The defiant Titan Prometheus reported to his Olympian torturer that for the first time his rule was threatened by the highest danger, unless he quickly joined forces with him. In Aeschylus, we acknowledge the union of the frightened Zeus, worried about the end of his power, with the Titan. Thus, the earlier age of the Titans is belatedly brought back from Tartarus into the light once more. The philosophy of wild and naked nature looks with the unconcealed countenance of truth at the myths of the Homeric world dancing past it. Before the flashing eyes of this goddess, those myths grow pale and tremble until they press the mighty fist of the Dionysian artist into the service of the new divinity. The Dionysian truth takes over the entire realm of myth as the symbol of its knowledge, and speaks of this knowledge partly in the public culture of the tragedy and partly in the secret celebrations of the dramatic mystery celebrations, but always in the disguise of the old myths. What power was it which liberated Prometheus from his vultures and transformed myth to a vehicle of Dionysian wisdom? It was the Herculean power of music. Music, which attained its highest manifestation in tragedy, had the power to interpret myth with a new significance in the most profound manner, something we have already described before as the most powerful capacity of music. For it is the lot of every myth gradually to creep into the crevice of an assumed historical reality, and to become analyzed as a unique fact in answer to the historical demands of some later time or other. The Greek were already full on their way to labeling cleverly and arbitrarily the complete mythical dreams of their youth as historical, pragmatic, and youthful history. For this is the way religions tend to die out, namely when the mythical preconditions of a religion, under the strong, rational eyes of an orthodox dogmatism, become classified as a closed totality of historical events, and people begin anxiously to defend the credibility of their myths, but to resist the naturally continuing life and growth of those myths. And when the feeling for the myth dies out, and in its place the claim to put religion on a historical footing steps onto the scene. The newly born genius of Dionysian music now seized these dying myths, and in its hands myth blossomed again, with colors which it had never shown before, with a scent which stirred up a longing premonition of a metaphysical world. After this last flourishing, myth collapsed, its leaves grew pale, and soon the mocking Lucians of antiquity grabbed up the flowers, scattered around by all winds, colorless and withered. Through tragedy, myth attains its most profound content, its most expressive form. It lifts itself up again like a wounded hero, and with the excessive power and wise tranquility of a dying man, its eyes burn with its last powerful light. What did you want, you rascal Euripides, when you sought to force this dying man once more into your service? He died under your powerful hands, and now you had to use your counterfeit, masked myth, which was able only to dress itself up with old splendor, like Hercules' monkey. And as myth died with you, so died the genius of music as well. Even though you plundered with greedy hands all the gardens of music, you achieved only a counterfeit masked music. And because you abandoned Dionysus, you were then abandoned by Apollo. Even if you hunted out all the passions from their beds and charmed them into your circle, even though you sharpened and filed a really sophisticated dialectic for speeches of your heroes, nevertheless your heroes have only counterfeit, masked passions, and speak only a counterfeit, masked language. Section 11. Greek tragedy died in a manner different from all its ancient sister arts. It died by suicide, as a result of an insoluble, hence tragic, conflict, whereas all the others passed away in advanced old age, with the most beautiful and tranquil deaths. If it is an appropriately happy, natural condition to depart from life with beautiful descendants and without any painful strains in one's life, the end of those ancient artistic genres manifests to us such a fortunate natural state of things. They disappeared slowly, and their more beautiful children were already standing there before their dying gaze, impatiently lifting their heads in courageous gestures. By contrast, with the death of Greek tragedy, there was created an immense emptiness, profoundly felt everywhere. Just as the Greek sailors at the time of Tiberius heard from some isolated island the shattering cry, "The great god Pan is dead," so now, like a painful lament, rang out throughout the Greek world, "Tragedy is dead. Poetry itself is lost with it. Away, away with you, you stunted, emaciated Epigones. Off with you to hell, so you can for once eat your fill of the crumbs from your former masters." If now a new form of art blossomed which paid tribute to tragedy as its predecessor and mistress, it was looked upon with fright, because while it carried the characteristics of its mother, they were the same ones she had known in her long death struggle. Tragedy's death struggle was fought by Euripides, and this later art form is known as New Attic Comedy. In its atrophied form of tragedy, lived on as a monument to tragedy's extremely laborious and violent death. Looking at things this way makes understandable the passionate fondness the poets of the newer comedies felt for Euripides. Thus Philemon's wish to be hanged immediately so that he could seek out Euripides in the underworld, provided only that he could be convinced that the dead man was still in possession of his wits, is no longer something strange. However, if we ask ourselves to indicate, briefly and without claiming to say anything in detail, what Euripides might have in common with Menander and Philemon, and what was so excitingly exemplary and effective for them in Euripides, it is enough to say that the spectator in Euripides is brought up on the stage. Anyone who recognizes the material out of which the Promethean tragedians before Euripides created their heroes, and how remote from them was any intention of bringing the true mask of reality onto the stage, will see clearly the totally deviant tendencies of Euripides. As a result of Euripides, the man of ordinary life pushed his way out of the spectator's space and up onto the acting area. The mirror in which earlier only great and bold features had been shown now displayed a painful fidelity, which conscientiously reflected the unsuccessful features of nature. Odysseus, the typical Greek of the older art, now sank in the hands of the newer poets into the figure of Gracchus, who from now on stands right at the center of dramatic interest as the good-hearted, clever slave. What Euripides in Aristophanes' Frogs gives himself credit for as service, namely, that through this household medicine he freed tragic art of its pompous hustle and bustle, that point we can trace above all in his tragic heroes. Essentially, the spectator now saw and heard his double on the Euripidean stage, and was happy that that character understood how to talk so well. But this was not the only delight. People themselves learned from Euripides how to speak. He praises himself on this very point in the contest with Aeschylus, how through him the people learned to observe in an artistic way, with the keenest sophistication, to judge and to draw consequences. Because of this complete transformation in public language, he also made the new comedy possible. From that time on, there was nothing mysterious about how ordinary life could appear on stage and what language it would use. Middle-class mediocrity, on which Euripides built all his political hopes, now came into prominence. Up to that point, in tragedy the demigod, and in comedy the intoxicated satyr, or semi-human, had determined the nature of the language. And so the Aristophanic Euripides gave himself high praise for how he presented common, well-known, ordinary living and striving, which any person was capable of judging. If now the entire crowd philosophized, administered their lands and goods with tremendous astuteness, and carried on their own legal matters, well then, he claimed that was to his credit, and the achievement of the wisdom which he had drummed into the people. The new comedy could now direct its attention to such a prepared and enlightened crowd, for whom Euripides became, to some extent, the choirmaster. Only this time the chorus of spectators had to have practice. As soon as the chorus was well trained to sing in the Euripidean musical key, a style of drama like a chess game arose. the new comedy with its continuing triumph of sly shrewdness. But Euripides, the leader of the chorus, was incessantly praised. Indeed, people would have let themselves be killed in order to learn more from him, if they had not been aware that tragic poets were just as dead as tragedy itself. With tragedy, the Greeks had surrendered their faith in immortality, not merely the faith in an ideal past, but also the faith in an ideal future. The saying from the well-known written epitaph, "As an old man negligent and trivial," is applicable also to the old age of Hellenism. The instantaneous, the witty, the foolish, and the capricious, these are its loftiest divinities. The fifth state, that of the slave, or at least the feeling of a slave, now come to rule. And if it is possible to talk still of a Greek serenity, it is the serenity of the slave, who has no idea how to take responsibility for anything difficult, how to strive for anything great, or how to value anything in the past or future higher than the present. It was this appearance of Greek serenity which so outraged the profound and fearful natures of the first 4 centuries of Christianity. To them, this feminine flight from seriousness and terror, this cowardly self-satisfaction with comfortable consumption, seemed not only despicable, but also the essentially anti-Christian frame of mind. And to the influence of this outrage we can ascribe the fact that the view of Greek antiquity as a time of rose-colored serenity lasted for centuries with almost invincible tenacity, as if Greek antiquity had never produced a 6th century, with its birth of tragedy, its mystery cults, its Pythagoras and Heraclitus, indeed, as if the artistic works of the great age simply did not exist, although these works, each and every one of them, cannot be explained at all on the grounds of such a senile joy in existence and serenity, moods appropriate to a slave, or of things which testified to a completely different worldview as the basis of their existence. Finally, when it is asserted that Euripides brought the spectator onto the stage in order to make him really capable for the first time of judging drama, it may appear as if the older tragic art had not resolved its false relationship to the spectator. And people might be tempted to value the radical tendency of Euripides to attain an appropriate relationship between the artwork and the public as a progressive step beyond Sophocles. However, the quote-unquote public is only a word and not at all a constant, firm thing of value. Why should an artist be duty-bound to accommodate himself to a power whose strength is only in numbers? And if, with respect to his talent and intentions, he senses that he is superior to every one of these spectators, how could he feel more respect for the common expression of all these capacities inferior to his own than for the most highly talented individual spectator? To tell the truth, no Greek artist handled his public over a long lifetime with greater daring and self-satisfaction than Euripides. As the masses threw themselves at his feet, he nonetheless, with a sublime act of defiance, threw his own individual attitudes in their faces, those same attitudes with which he had conquered the masses. If this genius had had the slightest reverence for the pandemonium of the public, he would have broken apart under the cudgel blows of his failures long before the middle of his lifetime. Taking this into account, we see that our expression, Euripides brought the spectator onto the stage in order to make the spectator capable of making judgments, was only provisional, that we have to seek out a deeper understanding of his dramatic tendencies. By contrast, it is well known everywhere how Aeschylus and Sophocles during their lifetime, and indeed well beyond that, stood in full possession of popular favor, and thus, given these predecessors of Euripides, there is no point in talking about a misunderstanding between the artwork and the public. What drove the richly talented artist Euripides constantly under the urge to create away from the path above which shone the sun of the greatest poetic names and the cloudless sky of popular approval? What curious consideration of the spectator led him to go against the spectator? How could he be contemptuous of his public out of a high respect for his public? The solution to the riddle posed immediately above is this. Euripides felt himself as a poet higher than the masses, but not higher than two of his spectators. He brought the masses up onto the stage. Those two spectators he honored as the only judges capable of rendering a verdict and as the masters of all his art. Following their instructions and reminders, he transposed the entire world of feelings, passions, and experiences which up to that point had appeared in the rows of spectators as an invisible chorus in every celebratory presentation, into the souls of his stage heroes. Following the demands of these two judges, he sought out for his heroes new characters, a new language, and a new tone. In the vote of these two spectators alone, he heard judgment pronounced on his creation, just as much as he heard encouragement promising victory, when he saw himself once again condemned by the justice of the general public. The first of these two spectators is Euripides himself, Euripides the thinker, not the poet. Of him we can say that the extraordinarily richness of his critical talent, like that of Lessing, constantly stimulated, even if it did not create, an additional productive artistic drive. With this talent, with all the clarity and agility of his critical thinking, Euripides sat in the theater and struggled to recognize the masterpieces of his great predecessors. As to those who know the profound secrets of Aeschylean tragedy, he became aware of something incommensurable in each feature and in each line, a certain deceptive clarity, and at the same time an enigmatic depth and infinity of the background. The clearest figure still always had a comet's tail attached to it, which seemed to hint at the unknown, the inexplicable. The same duality lay over the construction of the drama as well as over the meaning of the chorus. And how ambiguously the solution of the ethical problems remained for him, how questionable the handling of the myths, how unequal the division of luck and disaster. Even in the language of the old tragedies, there was a great deal he found offensive, or at least enigmatic. He especially found too much pomp in straightforward characters. So he sat there in the theater, full of uneasy thoughts, and as a spectator he came to realize that he did not understand his great predecessors. Since his reason counted for him as the root of all enjoyment and creativity, he had to ask himself and look around to see if there was anyone who thought the way he did, and could in the same way attest to that incommensurability of the old drama. But the public, including the best individuals among them, met him only with a suspicious smile. No one could explain to him why his reflections about and objections to the great masters might be correct. And in this agonizing condition he found the other spectator, who did not understand tragedy and therefore did not value it. United with him, Euripides could dare to begin emerging from his isolation to fight the immense battle against the artworks of Aeschylus and Sophocles, not with critical writings, but as a dramatic poet who sets up the presentation of his tragedy in opposition to the tradition. Section 12. Before we designate this other spectator by name, let's linger here a moment to reconsider that characteristic duality and incommensurability at the heart of Aeschylean tragedy, something we described earlier. Let us think about how strange we find the chorus and the hero of those tragedies, which we're not able to reconcile with what we are used to or with our traditions, until we recognize that duality itself as the origin and essence of Greek tragedy, as the expression of two artistic drives woven together, the Apollonian and the Dionysian. To cut that primordial and all-powerful Dionysian element out of tragedy, and to rebuild tragedy as a pure, new, and un-Dionysian art, morality, and world-view, that has now revealed itself to us very clearly as the tendency of Euripides. Near the end of his life, Euripides himself propounded as emphatically as possible the question about the value and meaning of this tendency in a myth to his contemporaries. Should the Dionysian exist at all? Should we not eradicate it forcefully from Greek soil? Of course we should, the poet says to us, if only it were possible. but the god Dionysus is too powerful. The most intelligent opponent, like Pentheus and the Bacchae, is unexpectedly charmed by Dionysus and runs from him in this enchanted state to his destruction. The judgment of the two old men, Cadmus and Tiresias, seems also to be the judgment of the aged poet. The mind of the cleverest individual does not throw away that old folk tradition, that eternally propagating reverence for Dionysus. Indeed, where such amazing powers are concerned, it is appropriate at least to demonstrate a diplomatically prudent show of joining in. But even with that, the god might still possibly take offense at such lukewarm participation, and transform the diplomat finally into a dragon, as happens here with Cadmus. The poet tells us this, a poet who fought throughout his long life against Dionysus with heroic force, only to conclude his life finally with a glorification of his opponent and a suicide, like a man suffering from vertigo, who, in order to escape the dreadful dizziness, which he can no longer endure, throws himself off a tower. That tragedy is a protest against the practicality of his artistic program, and that program had already succeeded. A miracle had taken place. Just when the poet recanted, his program was already victorious. Dionysus had already been chased off the tragic stage, and by a demonic power speaking out from Euripides. But Euripides was, to some extent, only a mask. The divinity which spoke out of him was not Dionysus, and not Apollo, but an entirely newborn daemon called Socrates. This is the new opposition, the Dionysian and the Socratic. And from this contrast, Greek tragedy perished as a work of art. No matter how much Euripides might seek to console us with his retraction, he was unsuccessful. The most magnificent temple lay in ruins. What use to us are the laments of the destroyer and his awareness that it had been the most beautiful of all temples? And even if Euripides himself, as a punishment, had been turned into a dragon by the artistic critics of all ages, who can be satisfied with this paltry compensation? Let's get closer now to this Socratic project, with which Euripides fought against and conquered Aeschylean tragedy. What purpose, that's the question we need to ask at this point, could Euripides' intention to ground drama solely on the un-Dionysian have had, if we assume its implementation had the very highest ideals? What form of drama remained if it was not to be born from the womb of music, in that mysterious half-light of the Dionysian? All it could be was a dramatic epic, an Apollonian art form in which the tragical effect is naturally unattainable. This is not a matter of the content of the represented events. I might even assert that in Goethe's proposed Nausicaa, it would have been impossible to make the suicide of that idyllic being, which was to be carried out in the fifth act, grippingly tragic, for the power of the Apollonian epic is so extraordinary that it magically transforms the most horrific things through that joy in and redemption through appearances right before our very eyes. The poet of the dramatic epic cannot completely fuse with his pictures, any more than the epic rhapsodist can. It is always a matter of still calm, tranquil contemplation with open eyes, a state which sees the images in front of it. The actor in this dramatic epic remains, in the most profound sense, still a rhapsodist. The consecration of the inner dream lies upon all his actions, so that he is never completely an actor. How is Euripides' work related with respect to this ideal of Apollonian drama? It is just like the relationship of the solemn rhapsodist of the olden times to the younger attitude whose nature is described in Plato's Ion. When I say something sad, my eyes fill with tears. But if what I say is horrifying and terrible, then the hairs on my head stand on end from fright, and my heart knocks. Here we do not see any more the epic dissolution of the self in appearances, the disinterested coolness of the real actor, who remain, even in his highest achievements, totally appearance and delight in appearances. Euripides is the actor with the beating heart, with his hair standing on end. He designs his work as a Socratic thinker, and he carries it out as a passionate actor. Euripides is a pure artist, neither in planning his work nor in carrying it out. Thus, the Euripidean drama is simultaneously a cool and fiery thing, equally capable of freezing or burning. It is impossible for it to attain the Apollonian effect of the epic, while, on the other hand, it had divorced itself as much as possible from the Dionysian elements, and now, in order to work at all, it needs new ways to arouse people, methods which can no longer lie within either of the two individual artistic drives of the Apollonian and the Dionysian. These methods of arousing people are detached paradoxical ideas, substituted for Apollonian objects of contemplation, and fiery emotional effects, substituted for Dionysian enchantment. The fiery effects are, to be sure, imitated with a high degree of realism, but the ideas and emotional effects are not in the slightest way imbued with the spirit of art. If we have now recognized that Euripides did not succeed in basing his drama solely on the Apollonian principles, that his un-Dionysian tendencies much rather led him astray into an inartistic naturalism, we are now able to move closer to the essential quality of his Socratic aesthetics, whose most important law runs something like this: everything must be understandable in order to be beautiful, a corollary to the Socratic saying, only the knowledgeable person is virtuous. With this canon at hand, Euripides measured all the individual features and justified them according to this principle: the language, characters, dramatic construction, the choral music. What we habitually assess so frequently in Euripides, in comparison with Sophoclean tragedy, as a poetical deficiency and a backward step is for the most part the product of his emphatic critical process, his daring intelligence. Let the Euripidean prologue serve as an example of what that rationalistic method produces. Nothing can be more offensive to our stage techniques than the prologue in Euripides' plays. That a single person should step forward at the beginning of a work and explain who he is, what has gone on before the action starts, what has happened up to this point, and even what will occur in the unfolding of the work, that would strike a modern poetic dramatist as wanton, inexcusable abandonment of all the effects of suspense. If we know everything which is going to happen, who will want to sit around waiting to see if it really does happen? For here there is nothing like the stimulating relationship between a prophetic dream and a later real event. Euripides thought quite differently about the matter. The effect of tragedy never depends on epic suspense, on the tempting uncertainty about what will happen now and later. It depends far more on those great rhetorical, lyrical scenes, in which the passion and dialectic of the main hero swelled up into a wide and powerful storm. Everything was preparing for pathos, not for action. What did not prepare the way for paths was considered disposable. But what hinders most seriously the listener's delighted devotion to such scenes is in any missing part, any gap in the network of the previous events. As long as the listener still has to figure out what this or that person means, what gives rise to this or that conflict in motives or purposes, then his full immersion in the suffering and action of the main character, his breathless sympathy with and fear for them are not possible. The Aeschylean Sophoclean tragedies made use of the most elegant artistic methods in the opening scenes to provide the spectators, as if by chance, all the necessary clues to understand everything, a technique in which their noble artistry proves its worth by allowing the necessary features to appear, but, so to speak, as something masked and accidental. But Euripides still believed he noticed that during these first scenes the spectator was oddly disturbed, having to figure out the simple arithmetic of the previous events, so that the poetical beauties and the pathos of the exposition was lost on him. Therefore Euripides set up the prologue even before the exposition, and put in the mouth of a person whom the people could trust, A divinity would necessarily confirm the outcome of the tragedy for the public, more or less, and take away any doubts about the reality of the myth, in a manner similar to the way in which Descartes could establish the reality of the empirical world through an appeal to the truthfulness of God and his inability to lie. At the end of his drama, Euripides once again made use of this same divine truthfulness in order to confirm his hero's future for the public. That is the task of the notorious Deus ex machina. Between the epic prologue and epilogue lay the lyrical, dramatic present, the essential drama. So Euripides as a poet is, above all, the echo of his conscious knowledge, and it is precisely this which confers upon him such a memorable place in the history of Greek art. In view of his critically productive creativity, it must have often struck him that he must be bringing alive in drama the opening of Anaxagoras' text, the first lines of which go as follows. In the beginning, everything was a confused mixture, but then came reason and created order. And if among philosophers Anaxagoras, with his concept of mind, seemed to be the first sober man among total drunkards, so Euripides might have conceptualized his relationship to the other poets with a similar image. So long as the single creator of order and ruler of all, the mind, was still excluded from artistic creativity, everything was still mixed up in a chaotic primordial pudding. That's how Euripides must have thought about it. That's how he, the first sober poet, must have passed sentence on the drunken poets. What Sophocles said about Aeschylus, that he does what's right without being aware of it, was certainly not said of any Euripidean sense. Euripides would have conceded only that Aeschylus created improperly because he created without any conscious awareness. Even the godlike Plato speaks of the creative capability of poets, and how this is not a conscious understanding, but for the most part only ironically, and he draws a comparison with the talent of prophets and dream interpreters, for the poet is not able to write until he has lost his conscious mind, and reason no longer resides in him. Euripides undertook the task, which Plato also took on, to show the world the opposite of the irrational poet. His basic aesthetic principle, everything must be conscious in order to be beautiful, is, as I have said, the corollary to the Socratic saying, everything must be conscious in order to be good. With this in mind, it is permissible for us to assess Euripides as the poet of Socratic aesthetics. Socrates, however, was that second spectator who did not understand the old tragedy and therefore did not value it. With Socrates as his ally, Euripides dared to be the herald of a new artistic creativity. If old tragedy perished in this development, then Socratic aesthetics is the murdering principle. Insofar as the fight was directed against the Dionysian of the older art, we recognize in Socrates the enemy of Dionysus, the new Orpheus, who roused himself against Dionysus, and who, although destined to be torn apart by the Maenads of the Athenian court of justice, nevertheless himself made the powerful god fly away. Dionysus, as before, when he fled from Lycurgus, king of the Edoni, saved himself in the depths of the sea, that is, in the mysterious floods of a secret cult, which would gradually overrun the entire world. Section 13. That Socrates had a close relationship to Euripides' project did not escape their contemporaries in ancient times, and the clearest expression for this happy intuition is the rumor floating around Athens that Socrates was in the habit of helping Euripides with his poetry. Both names were invoked by the supporters of the quote-unquote good old days, when it was time to list the present popular leaders whose influence had brought about a situation in which the old strength of mind and body manifested at the Battle of Marathon was being increasingly sacrificed for a dubious way of explaining things and a continuing erosion of the physical and mental powers. This was the tone, half indignation, half contempt, in which the Aristophanic comedy habitually talked of these men, to the irritation of the newer generations, who, although happy enough to betray Euripides, were always totally amazed that Socrates appeared in Aristophanes as the first and most important sophist, the mirror and essence of all sophistic ambitions. As a result, they took consolation in putting Aristophanes himself in the stocks as an impudent, lying Alcibiades of poetry. Without here defending the profound instinct of Aristophanes against such attacks, I will proceed to demonstrate the close interrelationship between Socrates and Euripides as the ancients saw it. It's particularly important to remember in this connection that Socrates, as an opponent of tragic art, never attended the performance of a tragedy, and only joined the spectators when a new piece by Euripides was being produced. The best known connection, however, is the close juxtaposition of both names in the oracular pronouncement of the Delphic oracle, which indicated that Socrates was the wisest of men, and at the same time delivered the judgment that Euripides captured second prize in the contest for wisdom. Sophocles was the third person named in this hierarchy, the man who could praise himself in comparison with Aeschylus by saying that he, Sophocles, did what was right because he knew what was right. Obviously, the degree of clarity in these men's knowledge was the factor that designated them collectively as the three wise men of their time. But the most pointed statement about this new and unheard-of high opinion of knowledge and reason was uttered by Socrates when he claimed that he was the only person to assert that he knew nothing, whereas in his critical wandering about in Athens, conversing with the greatest statesmen, orators, poets, and artists, everywhere he ran into people who imagined they knew things. Astonished, he recognized that all these famous people had no correct and clear insight into their occupations, and carried out their work instinctually. Quote, only from instinct, end quote, with this expression, we touch upon the heart and center of the Socratic project. With this expression, Socratic thought condemns existing art as well as contemporary ethics. Wherever he directs his searching gaze, he sees a lack of insight and the power of delusion, and from this he infers the inner falsity and worthlessness of present conditions. On the basis of this one point, Socrates believed he had to correct existence. He, one solitary individual, stepped forward with an expression of contempt and superiority, as the pioneer of a brand new style of culture, art, and morality, into that world, a scrap of which we would count it an honor to catch. That is the immensely disturbing thing which grips us about Socrates whenever we run into him, and which over and over again always stimulates us to find out the meaning and intention of this man, the most problematic figure of ancient times. Who is the man who can dare, as an individual, to deny the very essence of Greece, with which Homer, Pindar, Aeschylus, Phidias, Pericles, Pythia, and Dionysus is certainly worthy of our highest veneration? What demonic force is it that could dare to sprinkle this magic drink into the dust? What demigod is it to whom the ghastly chorus of the noblest specimens of humanity had to cry out, "Alas, alas, you have destroyed our beautiful world with your mighty fist. It is collapsing, falling to pieces"? A key to the heart of Socrates is offered by that amazing phenomenon indicated by the term Socrates' daemon. Under special circumstances in which his immense reasoning power was stalled in doubt, he resolved his irresolution firmly with the divine voice which expressed itself at such times. When this voice came, it always sounded a cautionary note. In this totally strange character, instinctive wisdom reveals itself, only in order to confront the conscious knowledge now and then as an impediment. Whereas in all productive men, instinct is the truly creative and affirming power, and consciousness acts as a critical and cautioning reaction. In Socrates, the instinct becomes the critic. Consciousness becomes the creator. Truly a monstrous defect. Now we see here a grotesque defect in mythical consciousness, so that Socrates can be considered specifically a non-mystic man, in whom the logical character had become too massive through excessive use, just like instinctive wisdom in the mystic. On the other hand, it was impossible for that logical drive, as it appeared in Socrates, to turn against itself. In its unfettered rush, it demonstrates a natural power of the sort we meet, to our shuddering surprise, only in the very greatest instinctive powers. Anyone who has sensed in the Platonic text the mere ascent of the godlike naivete and confidence in the direction of Socrates' teaching has also felt how that immense drive wheel of Socratic logic is, as it were, in motion behind Socrates, and how we have to see this behind Socrates as if we were looking through a shadow. That he himself had a premonition of this relationship comes out in the dignified seriousness with which he assessed his divine calling everywhere, even before his judges. To censure him for this is as impossible as it is to approve of his influence on the removal of instinct. When Socrates was hauled before the assembly of the Greek state, there was only one form of sentence for this irreconcilable conflict, namely banishment. People should have expelled him beyond the borders as something enigmatic, unclassifiable, and inexplicable, so that some future world could not justly charge the Athenians with acting shamefully. The fact that death and not exile was pronounced over him, Socrates himself appears to have brought about, fully clear about what he was doing, and without the natural horror of death. He went to his death with the same tranquility Plato describes him showing as he leaves the symposium, the last drinker in the early light of dawn, beginning a new day, while behind him, on the benches and the ground, his sleeping dinner companions stay behind, to dream of Socrates, the truly erotic man. The dying Socrates was the new ideal of the noble Greek youth, never seen before. Right in the vanguard, the typical Greek youth, Plato, prostrated himself before Socrates' picture, with all the fervent adoration of his passionately enthusiastic soul. This is the end of Part 3 of The Birth of Tragedy by Friedrich Nietzsche. Thank you for listening.